Do not work for food that cannot last. That applies to the human soul in all its time on earth. What we are thinking about is what we are being drained by. I remember in monastic formation in France, realizing very quickly that one had to, as we would say here in Ireland, cop on to one big error, one big risk, and not go there. That of doing so absolutely the external work being done manually, that the soul was also drained into it and was no longer available for what it was actually there for in enclosure. Union with the Lord and salvation of souls. This goes back to the Desert Fathers, which in the strict monastic life were still part of the formation. They had deliberately simple work, which was an occasion to allow the soul to be free to fly, and therefore seen as a continuation of both choir and formal prayer. There was no interruption. Living that teaching, pray without ceasing. And that was the whole raison d'être of perpetual silence, both in the desert and at La Trappe. It was so as to have a virtual cell where silence was the wall and no energy escaped in useless conversation. It was seen that realistically one needed to do other things as well as be in choir in the 24 hours. Therefore, useful work was done. But there was to be no interruption. The devil knows that full well, so he'll try to do his best to make sure that even manual work becomes glorified recreation, and the monk is forgetting what he's there for. And the value of the act then only has the value of the material act, forgetting this word of the Lord: do not work for food that cannot last, but work for food that endures to eternal life. Athanasius is an important writer and witness. Actually, both in theology at Bangor and in formation in France, he came up and took quite a lot of attention. In Bangor, we had to study him because he was the voice that stood out. Athanasius against the world. As one historian put it, the whole world woke up and yawned to find itself Arian. He, of course, didn't want the whole world to go that way, but he was one of the few who realized how dangerous the situation could become. The complication was, of course, that coming from interference from the state. Now, this saint was born in 295 at Alexandria. His parents were Christians, and he was given good classical studies. He was influenced by the great abbot of the desert, Antony, as a young man, and gave himself early on to the service of the church. Now, in that church of Alexandria, there arose a priest, Aries, who was preaching that there was a time in which the Logos was not. Therefore, he was not equal with the Father. He was on the side of the creature. It was subtle, but he saw it, though he was young, Athanasius, for what it was, an incipient heresy. Now, he was ordained a deacon at the age of 21 and was secretary and even advisor to the then Patriarch of Alexandria, whose name was Alexander, and he accompanied him to the Council of Nicaea, 325. Now this was really the first council of its kind. We have in the Acts of the Apostles the Council of Jerusalem, but here we have, after the cessation of persecution, and almost immediately after that cessation, the Edict of Milan is 313, and they're able to meet to discuss now openly theological issues which until then were a bit hidden underground and not really centre stage because they had other things to face, notably martyrdom. But now, with massive conversion to Christianity, all could happen. Now, the problem in the background is the fact that the good emperor Constantine, who had that Edict of Milan and had combated with the cross on the Labarum when going over that final point, the Milvian Bridge, in this sign he had to conquer. Well, he, of course, was defending the faith, but he was also involved in that faith, and that's the problem. He wasn't a trained theologian. Now, in this Council of Nicaea, we have the good, succinct definition of the nature of the Blessed Trinity and of Christ in the creed that comes out of it, still used to this day, essentially. And that could have been enough. Only Constantine reinstated, it seems, the excommunicated Aries. Now this was a difficult situation to handle because when the state gets involved, it can put bishops in high pressure situations where they have to stand very much alone, and this is what happened. In 328, Athanasius was elected bishop by the very acclamation of the Alexandrian people themselves. But very soon afterwards, this rehabilitation of Aries came into play, as a result of which 5 times he had to go into exile. Indeed, he spent 17 years of his life as bishop in exile. But that exile was fruitful insofar as he was penetrating also the West. He had an influence on Trevi, in the present Germany, and even as far as Rome, penetrating with the faith that came from Nicaea. And we must remember that the debate was more developed in the East than in the West in the early stages. Eventually, and only eventually, he was able to return to a pacified Alexandria and give himself to preaching and correct theological teaching and reorganization of the Christian communities, which of course by then was becoming also partly monastic. And this is how we came across him in parallel at La Trappe. I remember having to study him and write on him. He was a bridge. The very fact that he was influenced himself by St. Anthony as a young man led him eventually to write what he knew about him, that famous Vita Antonii, which is going to be a model for all biography in Christian centuries to come. It's well written, and it's also edifying, and it challenges any young man that reads it. And that was the case also with Augustine. He was talking to one of his friends in philosophy one day, and they noticed how two young men who had a brilliant military career before them abandoned all to go to the monastic life, influenced by this movement that came from studying the rule of St. Anthony of Egypt. And the one said to the other, Augustine and his friend, "Look how these simple people conquer heaven more quickly than we do, while we with all our studies here caught between two opinions." And they decided to embrace their own form of monastic life, which led eventually to the writing of a monastic rule, used both by sisters and brothers in the Christian West to this day. Augustine being one of the main four Western doctors, whereas Athanasius is one of the four main Eastern ones. Another important one, of course, is Basil, who was, as it happens, a key figure in the monastic life out there as well, the Cenobitic life especially, the equivalent of our Benedict, although Benedict was not either a priest or a bishop in the West, indicating by that very fact the monastic life is a charism within the church, not based on the actual structure of the church as such. The priesthood can be added, but in the case of the Benedictine life, as seen by Benedict himself, it's for the use of the community, not for ministry outside. Here we have then the great Athanasius, who is very much honoured in the East. Long prayers, long devotions to him in church. I believe that this is the ancient date that we have eventually taken in the West, the 2nd of May. And the long beard is a hint also at his patriarchal nature. That element of paternity comes in. Now, with regard specifically to his role as an autobiographer, it's to be borne in mind the power of the written word and also of the transmitted word. And I remember in youth having this huge influence coming from words either read or heard. Because in a monastic situation where there aren't many words, one word can go a long way. Today we had the reading about St. Stephen preaching, and the way in which at the end his opponents looked at him and saw his face as it were that of an angel. That is something that actually almost happens. Angelos is a herald, an announcer, a transmitter of the word. I remember at La Trappe twice being hugely influenced by a similar thing in two separate forms. One was a very powerful lecture given by not the abbot, the prior, Don Lucien, who was also my confessor, who had entered the monastery at the age of 19, way back, and was an expert, probably the world expert, on the spirituality of l'Abbé de Rancé, who in the 1600s had reformed La Trappe. He'd studied in depth all his writings and was able to lecture on them very well, and indicated how it was a body of doctrine that held, c'est un tout qui tient, it's a whole that holds, a body, logically. And I remember being hugely influenced and warmed by what he was able to transmit from that origin. And linked with that, something that happened one day when the novitiate, it was big enough to do that kind of thing, if there was a big event like 50 years of monastic life of one of the brethren, to put something together to honour that member of the community. And we did some historic work with what used to be slides in those days, with a recorded accompaniment, or even a spoken accompaniment. And I remember one part of that which paused at precisely the eyes of l'Abbé de Rancé. It took a poem of his, and while gazing at the only picture that we have of him, which is in the chapter, or rather the scriptorium of La Trappe, while allowing the slide to be there over the brethren, Etienne read this poem, and it was very moving, because one was listening to his soul coming, as it were, through those loving eyes. I think they were blue eyes, and there one could see somebody who had transmitted a charism. It was paternity. And as that same Don Lucien, the prior, said after the death of one of the brethren, Frère Marie, because the absence of the abbot meant that he would be doing these chapters sometimes, if there was business away for the abbot, he transmitted this. Frère Marie est allé à la grande trappe. He's gone to the great trappe, and indicated how our brethren were on the other shore. And it made sense, because in fact the community had never ceased to be since its foundation. It was founded under Savigny in 1142 and came over to the Cistercian reform in 1147, and although it had to go into exile precisely, it never ceased to be. And therefore there were generations upon generations of holy Cistercians that had gone on, unknown and unheard, conquering heaven with the arm of silence, the cell that protects the soul from leakage. This was the desert in our time. And one day we had an Eastern monk who came to us and talked to us in chapter and said, ce qui est le plus pur, that which is the purest you have. He could recognize in there the common roots of the desert, utterness of absence of simplicity. All was inward, all was working for the bread that endures for eternal life. And as in the East, so also in the West, monastic life has a counter effect on culture. It actually creates centers of contact to creating an ambit of beauty and interiority and suggestiveness. The divine office, the holy sacrifice, given prime of place as the Opus Dei, and nothing being spared, which is precisely what we find in the East. Enough time for God to reign. Let all mortal flesh in silence and with fear and trembling stand. Come down nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God towards descendeth, our full homage to demand. King of kings yet born of Mary, as thou bowed on earth he stood, Lord of lords in human vesture, in the body and the blood, he spreads its spangled on the way, as the light of light descendeth from the realms of endless day. Let the bars of hell may vanish as the darkness clears away. At his feet the saints bring its seraph, cherubim with sleepless eye, veil their faces to the presence, as with ceaseless voice they cry, Alleluia, Alleluia.